So, welcome. We have been talking about Charles Darwin for quite a while, and we learned that he is deeply embedded into a kind of Victorian understanding of role, of sex roles, of language. So, probably not everything Charles Darwin described was at the top of his understanding of the things going on in biology or in evolution. So for that reason, we learned that, for example, aesthetics. We had here Nüsslein Volhard. She was talking what kind of role aesthetics mean in the process of reproduction and selection. You know all the case of the peacock. What does it make sense that the peacock has this huge demonstration of its aesthetic attraction? Then we learned about accident, what actually the accident plays a role. There's a famous Japanese competitor, Kimura, who was talking about it's not that easy, that law of the fittest. Now, today, we have a special kind of sensitivity in this case of the discussion of Charles Darwin. The title has been taken over into the German, so you can imagine that the problem the German editor had to find an appropriate title. We could have called it Luder, but he obviously was not happy with the implication of that word. Bitch is something, special in English. I guess Virginia Woolf wouldn't have used it. I don't know, but it is, if it's not the biology in it, it's a wonderful storytelling. And I would suggest to you, you should not go and avoid that table of books. It's a wonderful way of probably small adjustment to what Charles Darwin wrote about. But it is such an incredible amount of facts that behind our theories, there are often sexual eyes. You see the same thing and you draw the totally different conclusion. If there are two bulls with horns on fighting with each other, you would always claim, according to our school classes, there are two males fighting for the female. Now you will see that may be contradicted today, and we are very happy to have Lucy Cooke with us. She's a trained biologist. She specialized in evolution and animal behavior. She was a student of Richard Dawkins, and she left academia in order to mediate between us, normal beings, and the facts that are out there in nature. And some of you may have even read that David Attenborough is getting old, but there is a youngster to come, Lucy Cooke. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So wonderful to see so many faces here this evening. I'm so grateful for you to come out and listen to this bitch give her talk tonight. So thank you very much. So yeah, I'm talking about my book and the ideas that we have about the sexes and how the sexes should behave and how culture has impacted how we see the animal kingdom. So let's just start off by, I haven't checked in with the tech person to work out how, look, I've got a clicker this time. So I gave a talk this afternoon about sloths, and it was a little bit more analog than this one. This is a bit more high tech. Okay, so we'll start off by talking about some of the differences that we think about the sexes, right? Oh, but I have a clicker, but it doesn't click. I'm gonna go. How do I move the slide? Switch it on. That would be a great thing to do, wouldn't it? Oh God, I can't even see where I can't do anything without my glasses. Well, hang on. Yeah, it's all right. I think I've got it. Hey. Thank you for staying with me. Okay, so let's start by talking about some of the sort of stereotypes that we think about the sexes, right? So when we think about males, we think about them being the bigger, they're promiscuous, they're competitive, they're aggressive, they're dominant, they're leaders. Females are smaller, chaste, nurturing, of course, always the mother role. That's always how females are defined. Weaker than males, submissive, and followers. Now, these ideas are sort of baked into how we understand sex and gender, and they have a long tail. They go back to this person that we all recognize, the big beard himself, Charles Darwin, who's my academic hero. I studied evolutionary biology. I think Charles Darwin was an incredible scientist, but he had a weak point. He was blindsided by the culture of the time, and his weak point was the female of the species, because he saw the sexes as radically different. He saw males as the dominant drivers of evolutionary change, and females were a sort of feminine footnote to the macho main event. He even wrote, even in the Descent of Man, which was his sort of difficult second album compared to On the Origin of Species. When he described his theory of sexual selection, he went as far to say that man has ultimately become superior to woman. So he really saw the sexes as radically different, and he saw this force of sexual selection as opposed to natural selection, the quest for mates, to be this driving force in the differences between the sexes. And those differences basically came down to the forces of sexual selection, which were male competition and female choice, are these two architects of evolution. And the thing is that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, of whether Darwin really believed that man had ultimately become superior to woman, and whether he really believed the sexes were different. And I guess we'll never know. But the problem was, of course, is that he was a man of his time. He was a Victorian man. And I think to a certain extent, with the origin of the species, he'd annoyed the church. He'd been pretty radical. He'd been radical enough for one lifetime. So I sort of think when he came to writing The Descent of Man, where he outlined his vision for sexual selection, I think maybe he was older, and if I'm being generous to Darwin, I think that he didn't really believe everything that he wrote. But anyway, he and but he did. He outlined the sexes as these very different sex roles that were sculpted by the forces of sexual selection. Now, of course, the problem with seeing females as passive, which is basically, if you were going to sum it up in one word, the idea is that females are passive and males are active. And that idea actually goes all the way back to Aristotle. And it comes from the simple fact that sperm move and eggs are sedentary. And so, it's so banal. It's kind of amazing, but that is where it all comes from. But yeah, coming from that point, females are seen as passive and males are active. So females are occasionally reactive, males are active. But of course, try telling a female spotted hyena she needs to be passive and coy, and she'll laugh in your face after she's bitten it off. I mean, we now understand that female animals can be every bit as aggressive, dominant, competitive, and sexually precocious as males. It's just that for over 150 years, scientists couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't, see them that way. So what I'm going to talk about this evening, and what my book is about the female animals and the scientists who study them, who have redefined what it means to be female. I'm going to start off by talking about the lioness, because that's really where my journey started with all of this. I studied evolution under Richard Dawkins, and I was very much taught the Darwinian paradigm, that males were the dominant drivers of evolutionary change, and they were the competitive, aggressive, dominant ones having all the fun, and females were sort of not worth looking at. Just a load of mothers, still fine, nothing to see there. It was probably no surprise that I left academia, actually. But anyway, I went off and I went to go and work, and I made documentaries for the BBC for years and all sorts of people. But anyway, I found myself about 15 years ago. I was making a documentary for the BBC and trying to have a conversation with a lion, as you do. And it turns out it's actually not very difficult to have a conversation with a lion. All you need is a recording of a lion's roar, something to play that recording out of, to a speaker, and then something to hide in, preferably with wheels. So I was in this Land Rover and with this lion specialist, and we had this recording of a lion's roar that we were going to play out into the gloom of the night, and the whole thing seemed wildly improbable to me, and I thought, well, this is never going to work, but we'll give it a go. It's television, what the hell? And anyway, so you probably already know that a lion's roar sounds absolutely nothing like the beginning of an MGM movie. You have that majestic lion's roar. That's actually a tiger. It's not a lion, because for the Hollywood producers, it didn't sound like a lion. Doesn't sound liony enough, so they used a tiger's roar instead. But anyway, it's true. A lion's roar sounds. It's this sort of weird, sort of like. Whoa. It's a bit like the kind of sound you sort of imagine Boris Johnson might have made looking for cheese at midnight in his fridge. Anyway, so I'm in this Land Rover, and we've got this sound of Boris Johnson looking for cheese, and we're playing it out into the sun. I'm just thinking, well, this is never going to work, And then it does, and out in the gloom, I can hear this, oh, and then we play ours, and then for like 5 minutes, we're playing audio ping pong with this lion. And then out of the gloom emerges not one, but 3 lions, 2 males and a female. And the males, as soon as there's nothing resembling a male lion there, they head off into the dark. But the female, she lay in front of our Land Rover, legs akimbo, and just sort of lay there for 2 hours, and we were stuck. We couldn't move. We were like backed into this thing, and we couldn't move. And so I said to Dr. Seifert, who was a German scientist, actually, what's going on, here? And he said, she wants to mate with us. And I said, well, isn't she mating with one of those 2 males that she's with? And he's like, oh, yeah, don't you know? Female lionesses are incredibly promiscuous. And, they've been documented mating with multiple males up to, dozens of times during their fertility periods. And I was like, no, I didn't know that. Like, what's going on? I thought only the males were promiscuous. What's going on? So that was the point when my interest was piqued, and I realized that everything that I'd been taught at university wasn't actually necessarily true. And actually, the shameful thing is that when I went to go and study, we already knew the truth, but I wasn't actually taught it, which is another story. But this woman had already worked out what was going on. This is Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, and this is her in, or you can tell from the outfit, it's sort of the late 70s, early 80s, and she's in India. And she's studying langurs, these sort of beautiful, slender monkeys that hang out all over the place in large troops. And she'd been sent there to study infanticide. And Sarah is really one of the kind of true pioneers in this way of redefining these very sticky stereotypes, because she was part of the sort of first generation of women that really received the same education as men, and she was able to go out into the field. And so when she went out to observe monkeys, and she noticed that the females were soliciting sex with all these males outside of the group, she didn't go, oh, I'm just going to ignore that because that's an inconvenience and they shouldn't be doing that, and I'm going to pretend it's not happening. She went, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder why they're doing that. And I'm going to follow them, and I'm going to study it, and I'm going to get some data, and I'm going to work it out. So she did work it out, and she realized that it was connected with infanticide, which is what she'd gone out there to study. So male langurs are often infanticidal. So when they join a male takes over a troop, he will kill the offspring of the females that are in the troop. And this had been observed, and nobody really wanted to believe that that was true, and nobody really understood why they were doing it. And Sarah worked out why they were doing it. They were doing it to force the females into their fertility period. So while the females are nursing offspring, they're not available to mate with. But then as soon as they stop breastfeeding, as soon as they stop nursing, then their fertility kicks back in again, and they're available to sire the new alpha's babies, right? So that's a strategy that males have in order to ensure that they don't have to wait several years before the females are available to have their babies and waste time bringing up another male's offspring to boot. But so she realized that what the female strategy is mate with lots of males in the outside of the group, and then if one of those males takes over the troop, then they're less likely to kill the babies because they might be theirs. So it's a simple rule: if you've mated with a female recently, don't kill the babies because they might be yours. So it's paternity confusion, basically. So pretty clever. So that's she basically realized that females could be just as sexually strategic as males. And it's not just langurs, it's lions as well. And it's many other species of primate. I think there's at least 60 mammal species that we know where the males have this strategy and the females have this counter strategy. And, you know, amongst chimpanzees, and you know, the females have been documented mating with up to 50 males a day in order to, you know, I mean, it sounds absolutely exhausting, but definitely extremely promiscuous behavior. And you'll be pleased to know that the females are getting some pleasure from this, which is another one of these sort of myths around female sexuality, is that only males get sexual pleasure, and that there's, which was another thing that Sarah took on very bravely in the 1980s. And she was like, well, no, I don't think so. I think the females are getting pleasure because it makes total sense. Why would only males get sexual pleasure and females wouldn't? Because, you know, you get pleasure from anything that's like beneficial for life, you know, and so of course females are going to get pleasure from having sex. And this illustration I have here, this is the only illustration I have in the book. And this was in a paper that was published in the 1980s by Suzanne Chevalier-Stolichnov, who did a very extraordinary study, the kind of thing that could only be performed in the 1970s and would definitely not be allowed now, involving all sorts of arousal devices, let's say, and primates. Anyway, she worked out that female monkeys are definitely climaxing as well as males, and this is the face that they make. So just if you see a stump-tailed macaque going, they're having a good time. Males and females, they make the same face apparently. So anyway, so both males and females are getting sexual pleasure, but that's another one of these ideas, is that, you know, that why would females? It's just another one of these ridiculous notions. Anyway, when I was researching the book, obviously Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy was very high up on my list of people that I wanted to talk to, and I reached out to her, and I was a bit nervous because she's a very celebrated academic with lots of papers to her name. And I was amazed that she said, yeah, come visit me at my walnut farm in California. And I turned up and she baked me a pie, a vulture pie, which didn't have actual vultures in it, but it had plastic vultures on the top. It had chicken inside. But anyway, she couldn't have been more helpful to me, and I was incredibly grateful to her. And she said to me, oh, you'll probably be really interested in my house guests. And boy, was I interested in her house guests, because they are the rabble-rousing matriarchs of modern Darwinism. These women are absolute legends, and it breaks my heart that they're not household names like lots of male evolutionary biologists of the same generation. And they are Mary Jane West Eberhard, Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, and Jean Altman, and together they stood up to these stereotypes and presented hard data to fight the to sort of redefine what it means to be female. They call themselves feminist Darwinists, and they're not saying that Darwin is all wrong by any means. They're just saying that he viewed the world through a Victorian pinhole camera. And really, thanks to these women and those that they've inspired, we can now see the full kind of technicolor version of life. And it's so much more interesting for it. And there's a fourth member of their crew. They meet every year. I mean, I don't know whether they do now post-COVID, but this actually might have been the last time that they really met, but they used to meet every year and chew the evolutionary fat and support one another and discuss things. And there's a fourth member of their crew who is Patricia Goarty, who's a kick-ass scientist who sort of could teach logic to Dr. Spock. She's absolutely amazing. She's also, like Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, she really kind of pioneered, challenging these stereotypes. And her subject was songbirds. So, songbirds, we always think of songbirds as being monogamous. It was always assumed, in fact, it was well-known fact that all songbirds were monogamous. And we've all seen songbirds in our garden. The male sings his heart out, he attracts a female, together they build a nest together, and then they raise the chicks. And it all looks so harmonious and sort of mirrors what's going on inside our own homes. It feels like it's just, but Patricia Goarty thought to herself, I wonder if it's all so sweet. So she was the first person in the 1980s. She co-opted forensic technology to do a DNA paternity tests on a clutch of eggs. Why not? No one had ever done it before. And everybody just assumed that they'd all have one father, right? Well, they don't. They frequently don't. More often than not, there are multiple fathers in a clutch of eggs. And so when she went to go and present her data at an ornithological conference in the 1980s, a very established and famous male ornithologist told her that the only way it was possible for her to have that data was if the females were raped. It's the only way. The females were being raped. And first of all, she's like, well, I wouldn't use that word. It's inappropriate. Sexually coerced would be more appropriate. And secondly, it's completely impossible because, songbirds, males and females, they both have a cloaca. The males cloaca, which is they both have a multi-purpose hole. The males have no penis. It's really difficult for them to force themselves on females because the male, in order to copulate with the female, he has to balance on her back and they've got to line up their cloacas. And, if she's not into it at any moment, she can just fly off. There's no sexual coercion in that equation, right? So, but nevertheless, despite the fact that sexual coercion is almost impossible in songbirds, that's what everybody thought. And everybody just agreed with the male ornithologist, that must be what's going on. Yes, of course it is. Females couldn't have sexual agency. And it took other female ornithologists like Bridget Stutchbury of to put radio trackers on female birds and track their movements and see that they were actually flying into other males' territories and soliciting sex with those males, and they were doing it quite willingly, all of their own, because there's lots of benefits to mating with multiple males. As Patty says, it's a bit of a no-brainer. Why put all of your eggs in one basket? You know, like, why would you? You know, so it's not that weird. You know, like, why is it? But it's culturally, it's offensive to certain people. So but thanks to Patricia and to Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy, you know, we now understand that females have just as much sexual agency as males. Through and in actual fact, Patricia's work sparked what was called a polyandry revolution, and we now understand that all sorts of species, you know, from snails to silverback gorillas, you know, that there is that the females are mating with multiple males for many reasons. So that's yeah. So females have just as much sexual agency. So, but what about another of those sort of great myths about males is that males are the aggressive ones, right? It's not particularly feminine, is it, to be aggressive and competitive? You know, when we think of you know, with these elephant seals, you know, these are sort of a kind of classic example of masculinity, of aggressive competitiveness, and of course females aren't like that. Well, they are, and arguably a lot more so. So I'm going to now introduce you to the most murderous mammal on the planet. It's not me. It's the meerkat. Yeah, the meerkat. That sort of lovely, cuddly meerkat. I don't know. Do you have Meerkat Manor on television here? Did you have that for years? We had Meerkat Manor. You know, lovely stories of meerkats all being families together. Well, actually, so meerkat society is tense and homicidal. It's predicated on ruthless competition between females. Basically, females are dominant over males. You have a single dominant female in a den. They live in family groups, and that dominant female is wildly competitive, and she doesn't want any of the other females reproducing because she wants to dominate all of the resources for her own reproductive needs so she can pump out the most babies in her lifetime. And in order to do that, she will bully the other females to prevent them from mating with other males. If one of the females, by the way, will be her sisters or her daughters, if they do dare, have sex with a roving male and get pregnant, then she'll evict them from the den, or if they give birth, she'll kill and probably eat their babies. So you know, like, kind of makes those elephant seals look like a walk in the park, you know. I mean, they're like, these are, and so there was a survey that was done about which animal, they surveyed 1,000 mammals to look at which mammal was most likely to be killed by a member of its own species. And you'd think that humans would come first, right? We didn't. We came second. Number one was the meerkat. Every meerkat has a 1 in 5 chance of being murdered by a member of its own, probably its own mother or auntie. So anyway, just to be really great, this is what meerkat society looks like. It's horrible. So you know, the thing is that you know, females are also really incredibly competitive and aggressively competitive as well, just as much as males, and of course. They are competitive in a reproductive arena, and the queens of the kind of competitive lifestyle are the cooperative insects, the social insects. So you have, in this instance, you have just one female that does all of the reproducing, and she's preventing all the others from doing any reproduction whatsoever. And everybody's just working towards her her reproductive needs. And in the case of these termites, for example, a single individual female can then produce 137 million offspring in a lifetime. Never going to remember all of their names. Yeah, so I mean, this is cooperative breeding is incredibly successful. So yeah, the meerkats are cooperative breeders. The social insects are cooperative breeders, very particular kind of cooperative breeder that's sort of fascinated science fiction for many years, and these ideas of these sort of dystopian queens that are pumping out babies and ruling their queendoms, much loved by sci-fi writers, and sort of reassuring that it only happens in insects and nothing like that happens in mammals. Except it does happen in mammals. This mammal is the only mammal that we know of that behaves like a social insect. So you have, who knows what this is? Naked mole rat, very good in a second language. I'm very impressed. So yeah, naked mole rat. I happen to think they're incredibly cute. I just think they're amazing, these animals. They live in underground colonies in East Africa, big colonies of up to 300, and they're ruled by a single dominant queen. And she's the only female that reproduces in that colony. And she'll have 2 or 3 males that she mates with, but the rest of the colony, they don't reproduce. And it's not like with the meerkats where, if they do reproduce, then she'll punish them. These ones in the naked mole rat colony, they can't reproduce because she prevents them from reproducing. And so I went to go and visit. I've always wanted to see a naked mole rat for lots of reasons. So I went to go, and I had no idea that there was a colony of them in a hot cupboard in East London. It's a very sweaty, hot cupboard where Dr. Chris Fawkes has been studying them for many years. He told me he thinks that they look like a penis with teeth, which I don't think says a lot for Chris, to be honest. But anyway, I think they're very cute. But anyway, I was very excited to meet his wrinkly pink tyrant in the cupboard in East London, and he's trying to work out how the female prevents the others from reproducing. Like, how does she do that? Yeah, so they don't go through puberty. They've not sexually developed. So she and her 2 or 3 mates are the only ones who have gone through puberty and are able to reproduce. The rest of the colony can't. And he thinks that she does it by being basically a big royal bully. So unlike the social insects where the queen remains stationary in her, royal chamber, and all the other insects come and tend to her and care for her and groom her and feed her and take the babies away and look after the babies. In the case of the naked mole rat, the female's constantly on the move. Oh, hang on, is this? Oh, here we go. Got to do that. Is that going to play? Come on, play. That's disappointing that doesn't play on this computer. What a shame. Anyway, what you would have seen would be this naked mole rat going through the tubes, climbing over other naked mole rats and pulling tails and biting them. And basically, they're constantly on the move. So the female's on the move, the queen, exerting her dominance by physically walking over her subjects. And so that aggression causes a lot of stress. And what Chris thinks is that stress prevents them from going through puberty. It affects their sex hormones. And so they don't mature. They don't sexually mature. Now, of course, everything works harmoniously as long as the queen is wandering around being a big royal bully. Well, hang on. No, that's not. It didn't work if I go like that. Anyway, it all works fine if the queen is being a big royal bully. But if she becomes weak and stops and just sort of slows down, then suddenly all hell breaks loose because other females start going through puberty and then they start maturing and then they start fighting. And Chris said to me, oh, it all gets very Game of Thrones. It's just like the gnashing jaws of death. And he said it's just that tubes are filled with blood, and if anybody comes in at the weekend and finds the queens are kicking off, and it's just, you know, absolute bloody mayhem in there. So, but it's an incredibly successful strategy. A single naked mole rat queen has been documented having 900 offspring in her lifetime, which is way more than you'd expect from an animal that size. And they also are extraordinary for lots of reasons. They seem to defy aging. Their telomeres don't you know, they don't age for some reason like any other mammal, and they're totally fascinating. So I could have written a whole book on naked mole rats, but you'll be pleased to hear that female leadership isn't always quite so brutal, right? Because, I mean, that's the other thing, as I always think, there's always this idea that, oh, matriarchy, oh, it'd be really lovely, wouldn't it? Well, not if you're a mole rat, not if you're a meerkat. No, actually. But maybe if you're one of these guys, if you're a killer whale, right? So, or an orca. So, you know, they've been sort of dealt with a rather disparaging name as killer whales. But, you know, orcas also live in family pods. And we always thought that the males were in charge because the males are bigger, and everybody always thinks when the males are bigger that they must be in charge. But as it turns out, it's not the males that are the leaders of orca society. It's the females, and not just the females. It's the post-menopausal grannies that are the leaders of orca society. Yeah. So this story spoke to me very loudly indeed. And I decided to go to the Salish Sea and the San Juan Islands off the coast of Washington State, where there's a group of orcas, the southern residents, that have been studied for 50 years. It's 50 years worth of data. And they've managed to figure out that that those females there actually go through menopause. And this is really unusual, right? So menopause is incredibly rare in the animal kingdom. For a long time, it was assumed that we humans were the only species that naturally lived beyond our reproductive shelf life, that had a post-reproductive life that was as long as our reproductive life. And, you know, occasionally there would be, you know, gorillas or chimpanzees in zoos that were documented living beyond their reproductive years. And it was assumed that the only reason they did so was because they were propped up by regular meals and modern medicine, and that human females were the same, and that we should be dying out, you know, in my case, literally round about now on this stage. And that was, you know, really just thanks modern medicine and regular meals that we're still around. So thank God, it turns out we're not alone. There are actually 4 species of toothed whale that we now know also go through the menopause, and they live long lives after they cease to have offspring. So this is really interesting, and the orca is by far and away the most studied of those. And Darren Croft, who's at Exeter University, he's headed up the research, and what he's worked out is that it falls in line with Kristen Hawkes' grandmother hypothesis, which is that the females, these sort of grandmother whales, sort of stop reproducing halfway through their life and invest their energy instead in their offspring and their offspring's offspring, because that reaps bigger dividends than competing with their super fertile young daughters. So instead of the meerkat approach, which is prevent your daughters from reproducing so you don't have to compete with them, the orcas have gone, all right, we're not going to compete with you, we'll support you and your offspring instead. And then there's that increases their genetic legacy doing that. So these wise old lady whales become basically the repositories for ecological wisdom that keep their hunting community alive, because orcas have just extraordinary culture, and that culture is passed down the female line. So, there's also an argument that there's a kind of evolutionary advantage to the extension of the female life in order to be the keeper of this wisdom, and to lead these societies. So you might be wondering, how do you study menopause in a basically a 6-ton swimming torpedo with teeth? And you do it with a dog, is how you do it. So this is Dr. Deborah Giles, whose job is to collect orca poo for a living. So I went out with her for 3 days, and that's her job. So she's like, poop's a gold mine, because you can monitor the hormones basically, because you can't take daily blood samples from orcas. So what you do is you follow them around and wait for them to do a poo, and then you catch it. Which sounds easy, but it's not that easy. It's a big ocean. So that's where the dog comes in, because this is Über, who was a former street dog from Sacramento, California, who was retrained to sniff out orca poo and now spends every day. Look, that's Über in her office, hard at work. Because what you do is you get the authorities let you know where the orcas are, and then you do like you keep a respectful distance. You do what's called a distant poop follow. Very scientific. And, you sort of go along, just carry on, and then you wait for Über to sort of, I that's what I found really difficult, was how she understood what Über was doing and what the signals Über was making. I found like really wild. But anyway, that's how you study menopause in orcas. Anyway, I was incredibly inspired by this orca society. And this was a society run by females that I did want to be a part of, which was gratifying. What really kind of got to me was how inclusive their society is. So this individual here has scoliosis of the spine. So it has a bent spine. You can see the fin is actually bent, and it can't swim as fast as the others. And, you might expect that individual wouldn't last as long, wouldn't live as long a life as the other members of the pod. But it did. It's documented living a perfectly long, healthy life, because it was supported by the rest of the community and by the matriarch, who would share food with him, in fact. And that I thought that was really an amazing story, because you're always told that nature's so cutthroat, but here is a story of this sort of society that's run by these wise old lady whales. And by the way, orca brains are amazing. So orcas have a 7-kilo brain that has more surface area for cognitive thought than any other animal on the planet. They have like this sort of incredible wrinkly prefrontal cortex that's just, where all the kind of cognitive thought happens. And they have a special lobe called the paralimbic lobe that we don't have, that only orcas and dolphins have. And where it sits in the brain, it suggests that it sits around the areas which process emotions, and it's full of cells that suggest that it's for processing empathy. And Dr. Laurie Marino, who studies orca brains, thinks that they process empathy and emotions in a realm that we can't possibly understand, which is kind of amazing, isn't it? So, and certainly Darren Croft said to me that, for years, they just studied orcas by looking at their fins on the water. And now they have drones. And he said it's like taking the lid off a fish tank, and you can suddenly see how they behave with each other. And they're so tight, like they have the whole ocean, but they're always touching each other, and they're like these really close, cohesive, tight. And you see it when you see the footage. You must have seen the incredible footage of how they hunt seals on ice floes. It's always in David Attenborough documentaries. There's some poor seal on an ice floe, and then the orcas come in and they do this incredible coordinated movement. So, this is an amazingly kind of like communicative, empathic, inclusive society. So I found their story incredibly moving. But what about primates then? Because that's what we care about, because we're primates. We want to know what's going on in primates. And of course, so who recognizes this character from the movie Madagascar? King Julian. Yeah. So King Julian was a ring-tailed lemur, and he was the king of Madagascar, right? Well, that's what we like. That the stories that we like to tell our children are around male leadership. Of course, Madagascar would have a male leader, King Julian. Well, if you go to Madagascar, which I have to study the ringtails, King Julian's nowhere to be found, because ring-tailed lemurs are female-dominated society. In fact, the females, it's another one of those societies where, it's not like the orcas. The females are pretty scary. In fact, Alison Jolly, who studied the lemurs back in the 1960s, actually, and told the world that they were a female-dominated society, but nobody wanted to listen. She said that the males are actually scared of the females. I hope this works. Is this going to work? Oh, man, that's such a shame. Okay, so that was a video that I shot of the females in the morning. What they like to do is they like to sunbathe. So they come out of their cave in the morning. They sit on this rock, and then they just sit and they sunbathe like a boss. But if any of the males sit in the best sunbathing spot, they get whacked. And then if you go to like a baobab tree and they're all eating the baobab fruits, and then if the males have got a baobab that the females want, it gets whacked and they'll take it out of their hands. Like the males are, they are second-class citizens, and the females are the ones that are doing all the territorial work, scent marking, and they are very much the dominant sex. But it's interesting, isn't it, that we like the stories that we like to tell are around that they're male dominated. And interestingly, if you go to Madagascar, there's over 100 species of lemur, and 90% of those are female dominant species. Now, lemurs are actually primates. They don't really look like primates because they don't really look that much like us anymore, do they? They're one of the first offshoots from the primate branch. So they are our most sort of ancient or ancestral primate cousins. But it's obvious when you look at their hands, you can see more the commonalities between us and them. But the fact that 90% of lemurs are female dominant, and the fact that the bush babies and the glaggas, which are the other prosimians, are also female dominant, suggests that actually the ancestor of all primates were female dominant species, not male dominant species. But, nevertheless, when we think about primates, we think of male dominance being the norm, and that they're all patriarchal. And we think of chimpanzees, and it's true. Chimpanzees are a patriarchal species. They are a species where males are dominant over females. It's not actually that much fun being a female chimpanzee. It's really tough. Males stay in their birth groups. The females are a diaspora. They don't form strong bonds with each other. And they are, the males are very much in charge. And they are, in chimpanzees, the society is patriarchal and warlike. And that has always been the model for human ancestry. Or it was, until we discovered that we had another great ape we were equally closely related to. And that's the bonobo. So bonobos, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the bonobo, but bonobos are pygmy chimpanzees. We share 99.8% of our 99.8, 99.9, depending on who you talk to, with both chimpanzees and bonobos. It's the same. We are equally closely related to both. But they have radically different societies. So where chimpanzees are patriarchal and warlike, bonobos are matriarchal and peaceful. And this sassy character is part of the reason why we know, because this is Loretta. And Loretta is the alpha female at San Diego Zoo. And she was studied by Dr. Amy Parish, who was working as a student under Frans de Waal at the time, who I know has spoken here a number of times. And Amy Parish figured out that bonobos were a female-dominant species. And, you know, one of the reasons why they're able to dominate males is because they form very strong alliances with one another, whereas chimpanzee females don't do that because they're competitive with one another, because they're unrelated. Similarly, the bonobo females are unrelated to each other, but they form this very strong alliances by having sex with each other, basically. So the females that in times that could be really tense and difficult, there's a lot of sex involved. Bonobos are famous for having lots of sex, but the females in particular gravitate towards sexual relations with other females. And certainly the dominant alpha female, you know, if you're joining a group of bonobos, you're a female, the first thing you'll do is try and ingratiate yourself with the dominant female, and that will probably involve sex. So basically, you know, sex dampens aggression and it fosters bonds, and it means that the females, rather than competing with one another, they have formed this unrelated sisterhood that then means that the males, even though they're bigger than them, can't physically dominate them, and the females are actually in charge. So I think this is really interesting. And, you know, anthropologists will argue forever about, you know, whether we're more like bonobos or chimpanzees. And, you know, that's sort of academic, really. But I mean, I think what's interesting about this is to understand how flexible things are, right? So just because males are bigger doesn't mean to say they're going to be dominant. It's not the case with the bonobos. Bonobos teach us the power of females supporting females. And I mean, the bonobos, of course, have overthrown the patriarchy through ecstatic same-sex frottage, which is, you know, one way of doing it. But, you know, what they teach us is that is the flexibility of this system, of how, you know, you can't assume that because males are bigger that they're going to be dominant. You can't, you know, in the power of female sisterhood. And also they teach us about the plasticity of sexuality as well, because both Amy Parish and Frans de Waal say that, you know, all bonobos are fundamentally bisexual. And this was the thing that was really sort of fascinating to me as I was doing my research, because I realized that I had biases. That was a really hard thing for me to kind of deal with, was the fact that I'm biased too. I became aware as I was going through the research of like, oh, okay, the indoctrination that I'd had, but I realized that I was very biased in a heteronormative way, you know, that I'd made assumptions about sexuality that fell along heteronormative lines. And there's a great example of how that heteronormative bias has tripped up science in the case of the Laysan albatross. So I took this photos in Hawaii, and the Laysan albatross are, you know, one of those birds that is pretty monogamous, actually. They not entirely, but they're, you know, they do their best. And basically, this particular colony of albatross, they've been studied for like 50 years by Hawaii University. Students go out every year and they log the nests and the birds and everything. And there's been this sort of weird conundrum, because some of the nests have 2 eggs in them, and there's no way that a female can lay 2 eggs. It's enough of an energetic expenditure to lay 1 egg if you're a female albatross. So there's no way that you could lay 2. So everybody didn't really understand what was going on. Lots of strange excuses were made for these nests that had 2 eggs in them. And then eventually, Lindsay Young, who's the scientist in the back of that picture there, she went, well, has anybody actually checked that the nests are, that the couples on the nest are male and female? Because they're identical. So But of course you assume, of course they're male and female. Why would they be anything else other than male and female? So she goes around and she painstakingly takes feather samples from every single nest, takes them back to the lab, runs the tests, and finds that a third of the nests on the colony are female-female couples. And she's so shocked by her results that she goes back and she does all of her lab work twice, because she just thinks, I've fucked up. That's not right. And then she thought, well, no one's going to believe me, so I've got to it's a third of them, right? So what's going on? What's going on? Well, what's going on is that most Laysan albatross nest on Laysan Atoll, which is like this sort of spit of sand, right? And this particular colony on Oahu is a relatively new colony, so it's been going for about 100 years. And with albatross, the females tend to be the sex that disperses. The males are less likely to leave and set up a life where they didn't grow up. So it means that these newer colonies, there's more females than males. Now, a female you can't be a single parent if you're an albatross, because it takes 6 months for the chick to fledge, and you need a tag team of 2 parents in order to be able to go off and find squid from thousands of miles away and bring it back and regurgitate the chick, and then somebody else goes off, and then you take turns doing this for 6 months. Can't do it by yourself. So what she realizes going on is that these females, these excess of females, they're mating with other albatross husbands, and then shacking up with another female, and then together they both lay an egg. So hence the 2 eggs. Only one of those eggs is going to survive, but they have a chance of, they have a 1 in 2 chance of raising an offspring that year, as opposed to 0, which is what there would be otherwise. So it's an adaptation to there being not very many males. But what's interesting about it is that in some cases these females partner for just 1 season, and then the next season they will partner with a male or another female or whatever. But some of these relationships just work. And there was one couple in her study. There were 2 females that have been together since she started her study 17 years ago. And they're amongst the most successful couples on the colony. They have 8 children, or 8 offspring, and 3, probably way more by now, but 3 grandchildren. And, they're at the top of the league for the most successful couples, heterosexual or otherwise. And she said, their relationship just works. They've just, at the start of the season, here we go. This is work. When they've been by themselves for 6 months, they meet up, and they greet one another again. Look, see, this is a male coming in, seeing if he can get into that. But no, they've got a vibe going on, and there's no interfering with those 2. And those couples, they do all the same stuff that the heterosexual couples do. They do the same preening, the same mounting, all the same sort of sexual behavior that increases bird oxytocin and keeps their bond strong. And their bond just works. So again, here we see this extraordinary plasticity of sex roles and sexuality in nature. And then there's an animal that's taken this a step further, and it's only on Hawaii. I didn't even have to leave the island before I found an animal that's taken things a step further and just dispensed with males altogether. So this is Leptodactylus lugubris. This is the mourning gecko, and this is an all-female species. There was this species of gecko evolved from a species that reproduced sexually, and there were males, but they have subsequently evolved to the process of making sex cells means that they're able to recombine, their eggs are able to combine, and they don't need to be fertilized by sperm. And so when the females are pregnant, as this one is, she got 2 eggs in there, you can see, she produces perfect clones of herself. So there's no need for males at all in that, in the the Leptodactylus lugubrious. And there's a number of vertebrates that do this. I was surprised. When I was doing my research, I didn't realize they were vertebrates. I knew there were lots of sort of microscopic creatures that were parthenogenesis and that they were able to reproduce asexually, but I didn't realize that there were vertebrates that had evolved from sexually reproducing species to reproduce asexually. Of course, these creatures are before there was sexual reproduction, there was asexual reproduction. So they're really kind of going back to before sex, and that makes me think about the oldest of all the stories, which I always get this wrong every time I tell this because I've been an atheist for so many years. But Eve was born out of Adam's rib, wasn't she? But actually, it would be the other way round, in all honesty, because females were the original sex. Because females lay eggs, egg layers came before that. But that we now know that there's been studies done and looking at estrogen receptors, etc., in mollusks, that the males evolved out of females. So first there were females, and then males evolved out of females. So that would mean that it was the other way around. So that would mean that Adam evolved out of Eve's rib, if we were going to get that story correct. And I think that understanding that fact, that really blew my mind to discover that. Because you sort of think of the sexes as these completely separate entities, don't we? That's what we've been kind of conditioned to think of, males and females as these really separate entities. And I think if you understand that males evolved out of females and that basically we're made up of the same genes, the same bodies, the same brains, the same hormones, then perhaps it's more interesting to think about what we have in common rather than what's different about us. And maybe that's sort of, to look at the common ground instead. And I think one of the places where it becomes really easy to see that sort of overlap between male and female is in the species that are able to actually change sex. So like these fish, for example, these are anemone fish, and they're one of 500 species of fish that within their lifetime they change sex. In the case of the anemone fish, they change from being male to female. So you have in an anemone, you'll have a male and female couple. They are monogamous, and the female's dominant and is the bigger one, and the male is smaller. And then you always have a few immature males in the wings. And if you take the dominant female out of that situation, then the male that was her sexual partner matures into becoming a female, and one of the immature males becomes their sexual partner. So you might recognize these fish from Finding Nemo. So if you were going to do a biologically accurate version of Finding Nemo, where little Nemo lost his mum, and then he went on a big adventure and he was reunited with his dad at the end of the movie, would have a very different ending. And you can sort of see why Disney didn't go there. But I think what's really interesting about this is that Justin Rhodes, who studies these fish, he's got this amazing laboratory just full of anemone fish, just like tanks of the things. And so he's really fascinated by what happens in that process. And so he's got loads of fish. What he's found is that an extraordinary thing is that as soon as you take that female out, the male that's left behind, almost immediately he starts behaving like a female, and he's recognized as a female by other fish. And you know that because the females are really aggressive, and if you put two females together, then they fight like billios. So you can tell if you put another female, suddenly he thinks he's like, I'm a female now, and he's like fighting, and all the other fish recognize him as a female. But his gonads, so his testes, they're still producing sperm. So as a scientist would tell you that that's a male because he's producing sperm. And it takes, because the definition of biological sex is whether you produce eggs or sperm. So he's producing sperm, so he's a male. And it takes a year for his gonads to change from testes to ovaries. So his behavior and his gender identity. So we don't talk about gender in animals because you can't ask animals what gender they are. It doesn't work like that. Gender is a social and psychological construct. It's separate from sex. You can't really discuss that, but you can, as Justin says, you can ask that fish what sex it is or what gender it is, and it'll tell you it's female, but its gonads are still male. So what's interesting there is you have this uncoupling of gender identity and sex, biological sex in this fish. So that's interesting to see that, and I think that it really illustrates just the extraordinary plasticity of sex, sexuality, sex roles, gender identity. It's all just a fantastic sort of plastic, that with all these amazing ways of adapting to different situations, and it just, all of it just makes an absolute mockery of this idea of these hardline differences that we see between the sexes. And I really believe, after having researched this book, that it would be these differences are bigger, far bigger culturally than they are biologically, and the time has come to ditch the sort of damaging and frankly deluded binary expectations, because in nature the female experience exists on a continuum. It's variable, it's highly plastic, and it refuses to conform to archaic classifications. And our appreciation of this fact can only enrich our understanding of the natural world, and I think our empathy for one another as humans. So thank you very much. I've slightly overrun, sorry.
Well, thank you very much. If you need any further answer to the big question, it's your turn.
I think you gave an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The question points to this slide and to the first one you showed. You have discussed with us what you have observed, or your colleagues observed in the among the animals, and that I would call is probably very stable, that behavior of all these animals, whether the male is dominant or the female is dominant, on how they interact. The human situation has one component more, that is our education of our behavior. So we can act against leadership or following. We can act consciously against aggressiveness or against weakness. And that, I think, separates the human, our situation, in many cases, of that situation in the animal kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, I don't talk about humans much. I totally wholeheartedly agree with you. The thing that we have is the ability to make conscious decisions about our behavior, which animals don't have the ability to do. But I would say, though, that the interesting thing about animal systems is that they show remarkable plasticity. So even with chimpanzees, for example, so all of our models of chimpanzee behavior were based on the East African chimpanzees that Jane Goodall started studying back in the 1960s. But now we're studying chimpanzees in West Africa, and the females are a lot more empowered there. The females hunt with spears, by the way. They have The chimpanzees there, they hunt bush babies in trees, and 90% of the hunters are females, not males. So, and if they were East African chimpanzees, the females wouldn't be allowed to eat that meat. The males would take it off them, and they would not be allowed to have it. But they are empowered enough that they're able to do that. It's not an equal society. But I think even within animals, I don't agree that things are fixed. I think that was the thing that one of the things that really came through to me from, and that sense of plasticity is obviously why we see so many different versions of, dominance and leadership and everything within societies. But, there's this plasticity, I think, is very heartening to see that everything is flexible.
So do we actually know what proportion of species are more likely female dominated or equal, or do we actually just not know that?
We just don't know. Yeah, no, we don't. Yeah,
because if you look at ungulates, for example,
so ungulates, for example, everybody assumes that the males but actually, and then they noticed that females would be the ones that would lead the herd, and then it was called, because it couldn't be females, couldn't be leaders, so they called it feeding priority. So female feeding priority in ungulates. But the females are like the leaders. And it is to do with the fact that the females who are nursing, they need water more than the males. And so they lead the show, but it's just, everything gets caught up in these, we're using words that are all things that mean something to humans and imposing them on animals, which is problematic, really, for a start. But yeah, in answer to your question, I think there's some really interesting discussions going on now about the difference between dominance and leadership and what power really means in animal societies. Because traditionally, power has been measured as dominance, and dominance is an interaction between two individuals where one dominates the other one, and then you do all your calculations, and then of the one that dominates the most of all of those situations, that's the dominant leader. But they're now realizing that dominance doesn't equate with leadership, because when you look at most primate societies, for example, where you have female kinship groups that form the stable nucleus of the group, where you have these matrilines of females that are all related, and the males are the dispersers, so the females remain the same. So you have the females are actually the leaders of the troop. The males come and go in a fist fight, but the females are the kind of the knowledge. And so all of these words and the way that we define things are all screwy, and all of that stuff I think is really exciting, is all now being reevaluated by some fantastic young minds who aren't bogged down by quite the same sort of cultural stereotypes that my generation has been, and are asking really interesting questions and getting to much better truths, I think.
Okay, talking about how we humans can learn from the animal kingdom, I think most of the times there's this argument that heterosexuality or monogamy that's how nature wants us to be. So that's like an argument that's pretty common. And when reading your book, which I really love, there were so many new ideas of how nature could be, or how other species are behaving, that nature is so variable.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so many different kinds of ways for species to live, that there's like, the argument is absolute nonsense to say something is like, that's the way nature wants us to be. No, it's about what we want to be and what we as humans want to normalize in our socialized education.
And I mean, and that's also, it's a very Western perspective, isn't it? It's about, I mean, I think what is an acronym? It's the weird cultures, Western, something industrialized. What is it? You're nodding. Weird. WEIRD. Anyway, it's just that so many of those presumptions about how humans are meant to be are based on, you know, white folk like us. Do you know what I mean? They're from industrialized countries that come from certain cultures, and it's not looking at all the other different cultures and ways of being that are out there, you know. So even within our species, it's been very narrowly considered, basically. But yeah, the diversity across the animal kingdom of sex, sexuality, sexual behavior is just, it's amazing.
Thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to ask a bit about the types of biases that you still see that we may have. You've touched upon a few of them. The gender bias was one of them. Just talked about the dominance definition of leadership. What other things that have you observed during your research, and are there any other lenses that we're either choosing to ignore or maybe are not as aware when we're looking at the data?
Well, I think there's and I think well, another one that springs to mind is geographic bias. So, for example, the idea that only male songbirds sing, right? So that's like been assumed for a long time that it's only the males that sing. And Darwin, actually, his theory of sexual selection, you know, song is like one of the kind of key elements of, you know, males have this extraordinarily beautiful song to attract the females, and only males have this ability. Well, if Darwin had been born in Australia, he might have had a completely different view of he might not have thought up sexual selection in the way that he did at all, because in all female songbirds sing in Australia. It's just that it's the species that migrate that the females have lost the power of song. So the ancestral state of all birds is that both males and females sing, and then in these migratory species, the females have it. We now know, but it actually is something like there was a recent study, something like 70-something% of female birds sing, and it was an Australian scientist that found this out, and she was like, well, you know, it's geographic bias. You know, it's just because so much of sort of this thought comes from the Enlightenment and from European thinking, and from, you know, so that's another example of bias. And you know, I think it's really exciting to realize that. I think it's really exciting to know that we've been trapped in these paradigms, and they've made us see the world just like this, you know, and now we can take them off, you know, and how liberating that is. But for a lot of people, it's really scary still, and they find it frightening and will challenge it, you know.
Hi. I was wondering, during your studies or research, did you find any example of male couples raising their offspring together?
Yeah, of course. In fact, my new book's about males, so I'm all over it. Penguins. You've probably got gay penguins in the zoo here, I think. I mean, everybody's got gay penguins, haven't they? I mean, every zoo in the world. I mean, so yeah, but penguins are a really great example. The males are often partnering up and raising chicks. I gave this talk in Amsterdam recently, and they had a pair of male vultures that had got together to raise a chick, which I thought was amazing. We don't sort of think of vultures as, it just seemed even sort of more wonderful that they were male vultures that were doing it. But yeah, so lots of birds, basically. You get males partnering. Yeah. Penguins, vultures, flamingos.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great talk. From all your examples, it seems like on an evolutionary scale, these dominant systems are not very much conserved. Do you think this is generally so across all animal species, or whether there are clades that are more conserved in this way, where always one sex is the dominant one behavior-wise?
So, I mean, I think that there's it where, I mean, I'm not, yeah, I couldn't, yes, there are, and is the short answer, yes. But it's the thing that's interesting is that it's you can't make assumptions about it. Do you know what I mean? And it's about the sort of interplay of the environment, and by that, that's the social environment as well as the ecological environment, you know, that kind of shapes how the system evolves. And maybe we've even, you know, I mean, there are some species where I think what's interesting is this idea of dominance and how that's evolving now, how we view that, and how, you know, lots of systems, particularly this book I'm writing about males at the moment, is that, you know, assumptions we've made over males fighting with each other over territory or whatever. And then when you go back and somebody studies it without assuming that the males are all fighting with each other and sees that the males are actually cooperating with each other, you know, I think that it's just another bias, you know, that sort of, so I think that, yes, there are still rules. It's not like I'm throwing all the rules out the window. Darwin was right. Male competition and female choice are forces of sexual selection. They are, you know, but it doesn't always result in male dominance. And what does that actually mean? What does male dominance mean? It might not mean the same as leadership. So what are we, you know, what does that aggressive moment in dyadic relationship really mean? So, but yes, there are some species where you see it more likely than others, you know.
Well, thank you very much. I'm interested in your little African animal where the female can reproduce over 800-900.
Yeah, the naked mole rat, yeah.
How is it genetically? Why does no defect, no?
Just they're amazing. I mean, they're honestly the stamp that the sort of all the kind of you know, all the sort of anti-aging, you know, lobbying. They're all obsessed with naked mole rat. I'm sort of, you know, Stanford. They've got colonies a go. You know, everybody's trying to. They've secret to eternal youth. It ain't pretty, but you know, they got it. So yeah, I don't know how they avoid the birth defects. They, you know, but I mean, you know, a queen can live for like 30 years. You know, she's this big. She should die after 3. You know, they're wonders. So yeah, good question. Worth studying.
Right.
Get yourself a colony. Find out.
That's always a wonderfully final result of a long evening, that we get home with some questions.
Yeah.
And some homework. And aging is one of the crucial things. Mr. Musk may be very interested in this.
The naked mole rat, yeah. Right. Send him underground. He doesn't need to go to Mars. He just needs to live in a burrow underground.
Yeah. Well, Lucy, thank you very much. And